Thank you so much. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me. And yes, apologies for the late arrival. I couldn't get into the call because there were so many people in it that they capped the numbers. But that's great news that so many people are interested in such an up-and-coming area of education. So yeah, learner analytics. I've had quite a funny personal journey of learner analytics. I started my career in HE as a student officer, and one of the first things we did was block the university using learner analytics on a sort of anti-surveillance thing. And fast forward 3 years later, and now part of my remit is developing and promoting and working alongside organizations and companies that use learner engagement algorithms. So I really did a full 180, and one of the things that Phil and me thought would be quite interesting would be to sort of run through why there was a change in my own opinion on it, and possibly different perspectives around it. So obviously we know feedback is a really important part of pedagogy, and good quality feedback is really important for improving academic confidence. And I've recently published some research on belonging, which showed that students that received tailored and detailed feedback focused on a growth mindset had higher levels in academic confidence, and students who had feedback lacking in detail, wasn't personalized. You know, it's not, this isn't sort of new. And the cost of living and ongoing effects of COVID-19 obviously has caused an impact in student wellbeing and mental health issues, and that's been replicated in higher education. And obviously alongside these issues, we have rising student numbers and an ever diversifying student body with ever diversifying student needs. Now, add into this the numerous claims on staff time and the delivery of both personalised and timely feedback, it becomes very difficult. So the solution posed several years ago, pre-pandemic, was student learning / engagement analytics, and that is essentially sort of monitoring student engagement with different touch points on campus to give them an engagement score. And as I said, you know, as a student union officer at the time, I felt that this was a really sort of like inhumane, conveyor belt, marketized way of running education that reduced them to an engagement score. And it lost the value of the student voice. And I was also concerned that things like surveillance and impacts would have an impact on marginalized people, particularly international students who might feel that it's an extension of Home Office surveillance to ensure that they are complying with the terms of their visa arrangements. Now, I do still stand by my position that embryonic kind of initiatives around this were slightly clumsy, perhaps. So, for example, exchanging data in return for like coffee tokens and the like, and you know, you can't always tell if the motivation's in the right place from the student. The methodology is not that good, and it could lead to sort of button smashing or skewed demographics and that sort of thing. But obviously when the pandemic came and things drastically changed, as we know, and student monitoring couldn't be engaged through physical attendance on campus, which I actually found quite funny that, you know, up until 2020, some physical attendance was still being monitored by writing names down on a pen and paper that was sort of passed around a classroom. And which is, you know, the fact that that was still happening in 2020. But during the pandemic, students went on campus and staff obviously began monitoring online through virtual learning environments. And you know, for all the protestations against digital surveillance that myself and other student officers had, the pandemic sort of forced us to accept it. So we're monitoring student engagement digitally, great. Obviously, this had limitations in and of itself. So one university I spoke to were really confused as to why only 20% of a class was engaging with the VLE. But when they looked into it, what happened was that groups of 3 or 4 students were booking study rooms together, logging in, and they were working on the content, but as a group, which is actually really engaged, right? So when we're thinking about student engagement analytics and the data that we're presented with, we have to keep on talking to students and really understanding the human part of the data. And I think obviously I'm not going to sort of like tell you all about learner analytics. I'm sure most people on the call know, but obviously basically it's a software program to collect data that goes towards an algorithm to monitor student engagement and predict outcomes. And algorithms to predicting outcomes aren't new, but they are controversial. So the Office for Students uses algorithms to benchmark degree classifications by demographic to prevent grade inflation. Again, something that's controversial within the sector. And the algorithm it essentially synthesizes digital resources into an ecosystem to give better insight into the student engagement. And they can be used in 3 ways. So this, sorry, just to say, this is like, library book checkout, student record submissions, VLE, swiping into buildings, that sort of thing. And it can be used to understand curriculum analytics, so understanding the overall education strategy, inclusion, outcomes, teaching. It can be used for cohort analytics, so how students are behaving at different points in time across different cohorts, and identifying patterns of behavior. And this is really helpful for identifying degree attainment. And then obviously personal analytics. So that is where a student is taking ownership of their own learning. And I always compare it to when you first get a smartwatch and suddenly you know how fast your heart's beating when you've had a conversation with someone who makes you a bit nervous, you know how well you're sleeping at night, you suddenly have all this insight into your health. And it's a little bit like that, but with learning. And the system can also be used to understand disengagement as well. And I think this is really good because normally we get students coming to us at the point of crisis, right? When they're, week 10, they've got a terrible mark and they, don't know what to do to fix it. But if we can understand where they're disengaging earlier on, then it allows tutors to have sort of targeted conversations with the student about the aspect of the learning experience that they're struggling with. And this is really great because say a student's engagement score is low, the personal tutor can look at the dashboard and say, okay, well, they've not been accessing the library that much. And that could lead to a conversation around anxiety in accessing archives. And this is much more positive and student focused and humane than a sort of unsatisfactory engagement email or just, poor attainment. And one quote from a student I spoke to was brilliant on this. He said that basically there's nowhere to hide because you go to your academic tutor and you can't just go, yeah, I'm doing loads, but it's all broken down and it makes it obvious as to what you're doing and what you're not. So, that's great. There are still some concerns. So I looked at some research around this and almost half of students reported negative emotions when accessing looking at a low score, which sort of manifested as stress and anxiety or guilt that they hadn't done enough to keep on top of their work. But the positive was that there was when a student had a high score, they were reassured that they were studying in the right way and they felt a sense of relief. And there were variables in subjects. So architecture students felt relief, students on foundation courses felt pride, and then health study students felt frustrated that they were engaging in online feedback in other subjects, and then computer engineers were more likely to criticize feedback as being too general. In terms of cohort demographics, the argument for this is that once an institution knows which demographics are at risk, they can implement support strategies. And I never really know what to think about this because in my own research, a lot of the sort of things that I found has been that institutions and students benefit by moving away from a deficit model that doesn't sort of ring fence certain students as the problem. And also there are a few issues around this. So one is blanket assumptions about what success is. So if we only measure success by grade outcome, it fails to recognize the value of higher education other than simply providing a classification. adds to the marketisation of HE, which, depending on where you're sitting, that could be a negative. Some students have raised concerns around discriminatory tutoring. So if a black students are getting lower attainment scores because of the demographic that they're in, because it's all based on an algorithm, does a tutor then write off a black student and prioritise meetings with students who are signalled to do well? Obviously, like, these are concerns that students have. These aren't things that I'm saying do happen. Is a student from a demographic who doesn't experience as bad mental health on average as other demographics overlooked or not checked in on? And then obviously 2 students who engage with their studies in exactly the same way, took out the same textbooks, logged into the same VLE, etc. But one student was from a disadvantaged background and one from a privileged background, may end up with different scores because of that. And obviously there's that quote about how you have to work twice as hard to be just as equal. So, you know, is that right in this into digital reality? And then obviously the other thing is GDPR obligates institutions to share how decisions are made. And if a student puts a subject access request in, is the university ready to justify why they've put an at-risk flag on certain students? So it's really something to think about. In my belonging research, I did speak to a care leaver who said that she often felt demotivated whenever the care leaver attainment gap was brought up. And also in the research I looked at around this, some students expressed frustration at their engagement score being marked down when they weren't engaging with study materials that they know do not help them. So for example, an ADHD student finds ebooks difficult to read. They can only read with the sensory act of reading it with a book in their hand, highlighting stuff. So they don't like ebooks, and they were like, I really struggle that my engagement score was low when I know that that would have wasted my time to engage with that kind of resource. So if we're going to assign students engagement scores, we really need context. We need to maintain that human aspect in the digital. And we need to, once we have a set of students who have lower scores, we need to investigate why and take steps to help those students. And I think that, again, coming back to the positives, obviously being able to identify where to direct finite resources, you know, ultimately that is efficiency and better, accurate way to start an intervention. And in particular,
so sorry, Sunday, we're going to have to we've reached time.
Oh, okay, I'm on my last paragraph.
Okay.
I was just saying that in the context of B3 condition from the OFS, which establishes continuation and completion progression, this kind of technology might be able to help institutions approach their support better. So yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I hate jumping in.
It's okay. I always write something, and when I read it in my head, it's shorter, and then when I read out loud, it takes me longer.
It was a really great talk. Thank you. It's some really kind of crucial talking points there. So thank you. There are some questions in the chat, Sunday, but I'm so sorry. Our next speaker has to leave shortly after, so we'll have to move on to the next talk. But if you could answer any of the questions, that would be really helpful. Thank you.